I was halfway through marking a land claim when the voices reached me, sharp, laughing, and just cruel enough to pull me from my desk. The words carried across the hot stillness of the main road, something about letting a stranger die. When I stepped out onto the porch, the sunlight hit hard, and I saw her at the old stone well. Barefoot dress torn to the knee, hair matted from dust and sweat, she was kneeling beside a man who looked ready to fall apart with the next breath. A dented tin cup shook in her hand as she tried to get water past his cracked lips. 6 townsfolk stood back, arms folded, offering nothing but stares. Before I tell you what came next, let me know where you're listening from, in the comments. And if you've ever found yourself in a moment where stepping forward might change more than just your own fate, tap that like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the trail. Gray Ridge wasn't much of a town, just a scatter of sun-bleached buildings lying quiet under the Arizona sky. I'd been here 4 years, long enough to know its moods. My name's Bram Callister. I came west after the war, not chasing gold or land, just a place where the days didn't bring noise or crowds. My wife and boy had died 3 years after my return, fever, taking them both in a mining camp near Santa Fe. I buried them myself, and the work I took afterward. This judge's seat was the only kind that suited me. Folks here never came unless they had no choice, and that was fine by me. I was raised to mind my word, to keep still when I had nothing worth saying, and to see to the work in front of me before I ever took my ease. My father taught me that a man's worth was measured in how he carried himself when no one was looking. We lived plain on the edge of a dry wheat field in Kansas, where Sundays meant quiet, and neighbors were expected to lend a hand before they lent judgment. That was before the railroads carved up the prairie, before land agents started dangling paper promises in front of anyone desperate enough to sign. By the time I'd seen what that kind of talk could do to a town, I'd learned that greed didn't always wear a stranger's face. Sometimes it was the face at your own supper table. Here in Gray Ridge, money had a way of deciding who mattered and who didn't. Ranchers who'd never driven a herd past county lines spoke as if they owned the horizon. Shopkeepers counted every penny twice if your boots looked worn. There was no room for mistakes, and even less for charity. That's why the scene at the well was more than just a curiosity, it was a measure of the place. A woman worn down from travel offering what little strength she had to a wounded man, while the rest of them stood back as if kindness were a disease. I didn't know her yet, not her name or her story, but I knew she'd done more in those few minutes than most in this town would do in a lifetime. I stepped down into the dust, the air dry enough to crack your lips, and felt every eye shift toward me. The heat, the silence, and the way the man's head lolled against her arm told me this moment was about to set a course I couldn't turn from. And just as I reached them, the crowd parted, leaving only the woman's steady gaze and the old man's shallow breath between us. The man beside the well was older. His skin weathered deep, his breath shallow as if each pull of air cost him more than he had to give. A strip of cloth bound his shoulder, stained dark with blood and dust. Isa knelt close, one hand braced on the rim of the stones, the other steadying the cup against his lips. She didn't glance up when I stepped down from the porch. The few who had been standing nearby shifted back, not enough to make way out of courtesy, but far enough to be clear they wanted no part of it. "You from town?" I asked her when I was close enough to be heard. Her voice, when it came, was low and dry from her own thirst. "No. Passed through a couple days ago. Slept behind the church. I could see she hadn't eaten much either." Her dress hung loose over her frame, the torn shoulder pinned awkwardly with a piece of wire. The elder's tunic held beadwork along the collar, the kind carried by men who had seen more than one fight and lived to tell of it. I told the onlookers to be on their way. They drifted off toward the saloon or the livery, muttering as they went. Isa met my eyes briefly, then looked back to the man. "Can you walk?" I asked her. She nodded. Together we lifted the elder, his frame lighter than it had any right to be, and carried him into the courthouse. I cleared a bench, set a folded blanket over it, and eased him down. Issa went straight to the water bucket, soaking a rag to wipe away the grit and blood. "You a nurse?" I asked. "No," she said. "Worked with one during the war, learned what I could." Her movements were careful, the cloth turned often to keep it clean. I brought her a mug of water, which she sipped slowly before setting it aside. Outside, the light faded, the air turning cooler. She stayed by the elder through the night, her back against the wall. Her head tipped forward, but her eyes never fully closing. By morning, the man's breathing was steadier. His fever hadn't broken, but he no longer looked as if he'd slip away between one breath and the next. Issa had not moved far from his side, rising only to dampen the cloth at his brow. I left briefly for the depot, returning with dried apples, hard bread, and smoked beef. She ate without rush, her gaze often straying back to the bench. The sound of hoofbeats came before noon. 4 riders appeared from the south dust, hanging behind them in the heat. 2 men and 2 women, one leading a horse with the elder upright in the saddle. The women dismounted first. The elder's voice was rough but clear. "She gave me water," he said, nodding toward Issa. "You protected her." His daughter stood tall beside him, the older introducing herself as Sana, the younger as Leia. In their way, they explained that giving life must be honored, that Issa, and by extension, I had a claim by their custom. I told them I took no wives for payment, but I would see their father sheltered until he was strong enough to travel. They carried him inside, settling him near the stove. Sana stayed close to him, quiet but watchful, while Leia's attention wandered toward the shelves of law books and ledgers stacked against the wall. Issa stood near the far end of the room, her hands folded before her, silent through the exchange. Later on the porch, I told Issa that the elder had spoken as though she were mine. She didn't flinch. "You didn't claim me," she said, "and you didn't deny it." I said nothing more. This was no place for Apache women or for a woman alone with no family to speak for her. She knew it too. We sat in the shade as the sun dropped low, saying little. Inside, the quiet shuffle of the daughter's movements and the elder's slow breathing filled the space. The day after their arrival, Grey Ridge carried on as usual. A drunk was found sleeping behind the smithy. A wagon load of feed passed through for a ranch 30 miles out. But inside the courthouse, the air was different. 3 women now moved through its narrow rooms, each keeping to her work without fuss. I rose early, as always. Issa was already sweeping, her bare feet pale against the cold floor. The tear in her dress was pinned, but still loose enough to show the freckles scattered across her collarbone. In the other room, Sana was at her father's side, a damp cloth in her hand. "He's stronger," she said when I stepped in. Leia sat cross-legged near a ledger, tracing her fingers along the columns of names, though she could not read them. She looked up and asked what the book was. "Land registry," I told her. "Shows who owns what if they're honest about it." She nodded as if she understood, her braids slipping over her shoulder. That afternoon brought a small hearing, a cattleman claiming his neighbor had taken fence wood. The benches filled quickly, more from curiosity about the courthouse's new occupants than any real interest in the case. Issa sat behind the desk, arranging slips of paper into neat rows. She never looked up, though I could feel the eyes of more than one man lingering on her. When the hearing ended, most left without comment save for Tom Ackerley from the feed store. He leaned toward Issa with a half smile, offering fabric for a dress. I cut him off before he finished, and he left with his hat in hand. By sundown, the benches were empty, the papers stacked again on the desk. Issa returned to her place by the ledgers. Sana was still with her father, and Leia had wandered to the old doctor's shop in search of herbs. Issa spoke before I could. "You don't owe me," she said. I told her I knew. She added that she hadn't asked to stay, just as I hadn't asked to be claimed. I noticed she'd stayed anyway. When I asked why, she said it was because I hadn't asked anything of her. That night the wind rose, rattling the shutters. The town had already begun talking, but it wasn't the kind of talk that faded quick. I could feel it building just beyond the courthouse walls. And from the way Isa's eyes held mine across the desk, I knew we'd both hear more of it before long. The wind rose before dawn, pushing grit along the street and rattling the shutters against the courthouse walls. Inside, the air stayed close and still. Isa was folding blankets at the end of the bench where Elder Jonah lay. His breathing had evened out, though he still needed help to sit. Sana worked quietly nearby, tending to him, as though she'd done it for years. Leah was already gone, her bare feet leaving only faint marks in the dust as she took the back road toward the old doctor's cabin. She carried her satchel over one shoulder, the strap worn smooth where her hand gripped it each day. I stepped out back to split wood, letting the steady swing of the axe clear my head. Through the open doorway, I caught sight of Isa reaching to place a ledger on the top shelf. The safety pin at her neckline still held the torn fabric together, though it gaped when she stretched. She didn't seem to notice. Her movements were deliberate, her eyes on the task. When she brought me a chipped tin bowl of beans at midday, she sat across the porch without speaking, her hair catching stray bits of sunlight as the breeze lifted the hem of her dress. "You've been running from something?" I asked. She looked at me evenly. "Yes." I asked if she was still running. "No." She stayed quiet for a while before saying she'd once been a school teacher in Kansas, widowed from a man she'd never loved, daughter to a father who drank himself into debt. She'd come west with a church group and kept moving until she reached Gray Ridge. I told her I'd served in the war, lost my family to fever, and come here because it was quiet. And now she asked. I said nothing, but we both knew the quiet had changed. By late afternoon, a knock came at the front door. Reverend Tillman stood there, Bible tucked under one arm, his smile tight. "Just checking in," he said, his eyes shifting past me toward the room beyond. "Lot of movement here lately. Folks want me sure all's proper." I told him it was a courthouse, not a church. He pressed about Isa and the daughters, the words polite but the meaning plain. I closed the door before he finished. That evening, Isa was sitting beside the desk, a cup of tea in her hands, her feet tucked under the chair. I crossed the room and sat beside her. She tilted her head slightly. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked. "No," I said. "You're sure?" "Yes." Her gaze dropped to the cup. "Then tell me to stay. Not because it's quiet, not because I'm useful." I told her to stay, and her fingers brushed mine before she looked back toward the stove. The next day, word seemed to travel faster. 2 women at the Mercantile whispered near the sugar barrels. And by sundown, I could hear the talk in the saloon before I stepped inside. By morning, Sheriff Kincaid came to the courthouse. He lingered on the porch, his stance too casual to be unplanned. "Folks are asking what kind of court you're running," he said. "You've got Apache women here, and that school teacher without a ring." I told him if anyone had a charge to bring, they could file it proper. "You're making it harder for yourself," he warned. I told him to leave. Isa had heard it all. When I turned, she was standing by the stove, a chipped cup cradled in her hands. "They'll keep coming," she said. I told her I was defending the roof over all of us. That night, Sana spoke to Isa for the first time without me present. I heard her voice low and steady. "You stayed too long. Town won't forgive it." Isa said she hadn't asked them to. "You care for the judge," Sana said. Isa paused before answering yes. Sana nodded. "Then stay close. Not for him, for yourself." Later, Isa joined me on the porch. The boards creaked under her bare feet. "You all right?" I asked. She nodded. "I've lived through worse." I said she shouldn't have to. She answered that she had anyway. She touched my hand lightly, and I didn't move away. Inside the room stayed warm, the sound of Sana's beadwork faint in the background. Outside, the wind pushed along the empty street. The following morning, I saw them gathered at the far end of town. 7 men, 2 women behind them, and Concade near the back. Ephraim Jensen, always ready to stir trouble, stepped forward to say, this was about who I was letting into Grey Ridge. I told him they'd broken no law. He said they didn't belong. I reminded him that when the elder lay dying at the well, none of them had moved. Isa had. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Isa walking back from an errand, a folded cloth in her hands. She slowed when she saw the group, but didn't turn around. Tom Akerley stepped into her path. You should be ashamed, he said. She didn't answer. I walked over and stood beside her until he stepped back. She's not leaving, I told him, and you're not speaking to her again. I turned to the others and said if they wanted a hearing, they could file it. Otherwise, they had the wrong town. Inside, Sana's eyes met mine when we returned. Isa set the cloth on the desk and stood across from me. You didn't need to do that, she said. I told her I did. They'll hate you for it, she said. They already do, I replied. She stepped closer, her eyes steady. You said I could stay. I told her I meant it. Her hand came to rest over mine, firm and certain, before she leaned in and kissed me. When she pulled back, she said, then I'm not going anywhere. The room was quiet except for the fire the moment holding like the still air before rain. Whatever came next, the course had been set. The morning after the crowd gathered, the street was empty again, but the air held the same weight. Isa moved about the room without pause, sorting folded linens into a neat stack. Her sleeves pushed up past her elbows. Leia was bent over a bundle of herbs at the table, the scent of juniper and sage drifting through the courthouse. Sana sat near her father, a small knife in hand, as she trimmed away loose threads from the patchwork blanket covering him. I stepped outside for a moment. The dust from the previous day's wind had settled into the porch boards. Across the road, the smithy's door was half open, the sound of hammering steady and sure. There were no whispers today, at least not loud enough to carry. I returned inside, setting my hat on the peg. Isa looked up briefly when I passed her, then back to her work. By noon, the courthouse had the stillness of a Sunday. Leia slipped away to the doctor's place, her satchel swinging lightly from her shoulder. Sana followed her with her eyes, then glanced at me. She will want to stay, she said. She thinks she can learn more. I asked if she meant to stay herself. Only until he can travel, she answered, nodding toward the elder. She hesitated, then added, You look at Isa differently. You should know what it means to give water when no one else will. Her words stayed with me as the afternoon stretched on. Isa worked through a small pile of claim slips, her fingers smudged faintly with ink. She didn't speak, but when she shifted the faint brush of her arm against mine, was enough to hold my attention. The lamplight caught the curve of her cheek, the loose strands of hair that had fallen forward. When the last of the papers was set aside, I told her the back room could be cleared if she wanted more space. She met my eyes steady. I'm not looking for a separate place, she said. I'm here because I chose to be. She said it without pause, as if the choice had been settled some time ago. That evening, after the elder had been helped to his bed and Sana had gone quiet in the corner, I found Isa on the porch. The air had cooled, and she stood with her arms folded, watching the line where the road met the darkening ridge. I stepped beside her. She asked if I'd ever thought about leaving Grey Ridge. I told her I hadn't. Then you understand, she said. Some places you stay because they give you peace. Others because you can't think of anywhere else to go. We stood there until the light faded completely. The boards cool underfoot, the sounds of the town reduced to a few scattered voices from the saloon. When we finally went inside, she brushed past me at the door, her hand brushing mine just long enough for me to know it wasn't by chance. The days that followed found a new rhythm. Leia returned each evening with a few new plants or strips of bark tucked into her satchel, her hands sometimes stained with dye. Sana kept to her father's side, speaking little, her focus fixed on his recovery. Issa stayed near the desk, sorting and filing without needing to be asked. She moved with quiet purpose, her bare feet soundless on the boards, her presence filling the space in a way I couldn't ignore. By midweek, I began setting aside time to work on the small back room. The boards had been stacked in the lean-to behind the courthouse for months, too weathered for the main floor, but sound enough for a partition. I measured and cut each piece, the smell of fresh-shaved pine mixing with the faint scent of herbs from Leia's table. Issa passed by a few times carrying water or a stack of papers, her eyes taking in the half-built wall without comment. One evening, after I'd set the last upright beam, I told her the room would be hers if she wanted it. She stepped inside, running her fingers lightly along the frame. "You're building me a door," she said. I told her it was more than that. She looked at me for a long moment before nodding once. The next morning, the elder rose without help for the first time. Sana wrapped him in a patched hide coat and helped him to the bench by the fire. He sat quietly, his gaze moving from one of us to the next. When his eyes settled on Issa, he gave a slow, final nod. That afternoon, 2 of his tribesmen arrived to take him home. He accepted their help without resistance, but not before telling his daughters they were free to choose their own path. After he left, Sana began packing. She owned little beyond a few pieces of beadwork and the knife she carried at her belt. Issa handed her a bundle wrapped in cloth-dried meat bread and a strip of leather decorated with a small beaded pattern. They stood facing each other for a moment, no smiles, just a shared understanding. Then Sana was gone, heading north on foot until the road curved out of sight. The courthouse felt quieter that evening, though not empty. Leia moved more easily now, her voice lighter, as she worked alongside Issa at the desk. I finished hanging the new door, testing the latch before stepping back. Issa ran her hand over the smooth wood, then turned toward me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Inside was a ring I'd filed myself from a silver coin, the edge still slightly uneven. I told her I wasn't good with speeches, but if staying meant more than just company, I wanted it to be clear. She looked at the ring, then at me. "I've already said yes," she said quietly, and slid it onto her finger. She pulled me down by the collar and kissed me. The room around us stayed warm, the faint sound of Leia humming at the table carrying through the open doorway. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of wood smoke from somewhere up the ridge. Whatever lay ahead, the choice had been made. The first frost came without warning, silvering the rooftops before the sun reached over the ridge. The courthouse stove burned steady, its warmth pushing back against the bite in the air. Leia was at the table grinding dried willow bark into a fine powder, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders. Issa stood by the stove, stirring a pot with one hand, while her other rested lightly against the edge of the counter, the ring I'd given her catching the firelight in a dull glint. I had spent the early hours finishing the latch on the new door. It was nothing fancy, 2 hinges, a simple hook, but it swung smooth and shut with a solid sound. Issa stepped inside, running her palm over the wood before glancing at me. "It feels finished," she said. I told her it was hers, a place to close off if she wanted. She didn't answer right away, just nodded once and went back to the pot. By mid-morning, a knock sounded at the front door. Sheriff Kincaid stood there, hat in hand, his breath visible in the cold. "Pastor's got papers," he said. "If you and Miss Issa want it done quiet, I can handle it here." Issa turned from the stove, her eyes moving between us. "Today?" I asked. He nodded. No bells, no sermon, just ink on a page. Issa's mouth curved slightly. "If we're already staying," she said. We may as well sign the door. An hour later, we stood at the desk with the sheriff reading off the words, his voice even. I said I do. Isa echoed it, her voice low but sure. We signed, the sheriff tipped his hat, and it was done. No crowd, no blessing. Just the sound of the pen scratching across paper. That evening, the four of us shared supper as usual. Leah hummed under her breath while slicing the bread. Isa ladled stew into bowls and set mine in front of me without a word. The air inside was warm, the windows fogged from the heat. Later, she passed behind my chair, her hand brushing my shoulder in a small, steady touch before she moved on. The next days settled into a rhythm that felt different from before. Isa rose early to tend the fire, her hair loose down her back until she pinned it up after breakfast. Leah kept taking in townsfolk with coughs or sore joints, the trust she'd earned carrying her further than I expected. Even Kincaid came by for a toothache remedy, leaving with a wrapped packet and a muttered thanks. One afternoon, Isa lingered at the desk after the others had gone to their work. She set aside a stack of claims, then leaned against the edge watching me. You still certain about this? She asked. I said I was. Not even the past, she pressed. I told her it had brought her here and I wouldn't change that. She looked at me for a long moment before returning to her seat, the faintest trace of relief in her face. The snow came early, soft at first, muffling the street outside. Horses stood under tarps at the hitch rails, their breath rising in small clouds. The saloon's doors stayed still most of the day, and the usual hammering from the smithy was absent. Inside, the courthouse felt smaller, the walls holding the heat close. Isa worked near the stove, her hand now often resting on her stomach without her seeming to notice. One evening, as the snow thickened, she told me in a voice just above a whisper. I didn't say much, just nodded and pulled her close, letting the quiet between us speak. Leah was in the other room, sorting dried roots into jars, her movements steady and unhurried. Outside, the wind pushed against the shutters, the sound deep and low. We ended that night sitting by the fire, the lamplight catching the curve of Isa's cheek as she rested against my arm. Whatever storms the town might stir again, the walls around us felt solid, the warmth earned. And though the ridge lay hidden under falling snow, I could sense something coming with the next change in weather. The snow kept on through the night, and by morning the street was covered in a thin white crust that crunched underfoot. The hitch rails stood empty, except for a single mule tied outside the mercantile. Inside the courthouse, the air was close with the smell of burning oak. Isa moved slowly, ladling porridge into tin bowls. Her hand lingered on her middle when she thought no one was watching. Leah came in from the cold, her cheeks red, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She laid it on the desk and unwrapped 2 jars of dark liquid for Mrs. Cummings' cough, she said, setting them aside. Isa asked how the woman was doing. Leah shrugged. Better, maybe. She says she's sleeping longer. She went to hang her coat near the stove, the frost melting into small drops that pattered on the floorboards. I had court business that morning, a rancher and a prospector disputing a boundary line. The hearing was short, tempers barely checked. When it was done, the benches cleared quickly, though I caught more than one sideways glance toward Isa as she carried empty cups back to the counter. The talk in town had quieted some, but it hadn't gone away. That afternoon, Isa was mending a tear in one of my coats at the desk. She worked with her head bent, the lamplight catching on the silver band at her finger. I told her I'd be heading out to check on a property claim before the snow got any deeper. She looked up, her brow creasing. How far? I told her it was about 4 miles south. Don't linger, she said. Weather's turning again. By the time I reached the claim marker, the sky had darkened with low clouds. I checked the post, measured the distance to the creek, and noted the figures in my ledger before heading back. The wind was at my back, carrying the scent of snow. When the courthouse came into view, I saw a figure on horseback paused at the hitch rail. The rider was a tall man wrapped in a dark coat, his hat pulled low against the wind. He dismounted slowly, tying his reins before stepping onto the porch. By the time I reached him, Isa was at the door, her hand on the frame. "Judge Callister," the man asked. I nodded. He introduced himself as Eli Thatcher, 39, a freight hauler from Hullbrook. He had a message from the tribal camp north of the ridge. The elder had sent word. Inside, Thatcher stamped the snow from his boots and produced a folded paper, the edges stiff from the cold. I opened it at the desk. The writing was spare but clear. The elder's travels had been hard. He was resting near the canyon, but trouble had been brewing along the route back, and there were men looking for reason to strike at anyone tied to him. Isa read over my shoulder, her lips pressing tight. "Does that mean here?" she asked. Thatcher didn't answer directly. "I'd keep your doors bolted at night," he said. "There's been talk in Hullbrook, and talk has a way of riding fast." He stayed long enough for a cup of coffee, then pulled his coat tight and stepped back into the cold. After he left the room, seemed smaller. Isa went back to her sewing, though her stitches slowed. Leia busied herself with her jars. I checked the lock on the back door and set an extra piece of wood across it. That evening, as the snow piled higher against the steps, Isa came to stand beside me at the window. "If they come here," she said quietly, "we'll be ready." I told her we would. The wind picked up after sundown, rattling the shutters and bending the flame in the lamp. Sana's absence was felt more in moments like this, her watchful presence replaced by the soft hum of Leia's work and Isa's steady movements in the kitchen. I sat at the desk, writing out notices for the spring hearings, while Isa set bread to rise near the stove. Every so often, she glanced at the door as if listening for something beyond the howl of the wind. When we finally turned in, I checked each window latch and banked the fire low. Isa settled under the blankets, her back to the wall, her eyes still open. I lay beside her, the sound of the wind in my ears, knowing the message Thatcher had brought was more than a simple warning. It was a shift in the trail ahead, and we'd need to be ready for what came next. The snow had started to crust over, hard enough that boots left only shallow prints on the main road. The cold came early that day, a dry sharpness in the air that carried sound farther than usual. From my desk, I could hear the faint clink of Leia setting jars in a row on the kitchen shelf. Isa was mending one of my shirts near the stove, her hair pulled back loosely, sleeves pushed above her elbows. Just after noon, hoofbeats sounded on the hard-packed snow. Isa glanced toward the window, her needle pausing mid-stitch. A moment later, a sharp knock rattled the door. When I opened it, Eli Thatcher stood on the porch again, his breath clouding in the cold. He stepped inside, quickly rubbing his hands together. "Judge," he said, "that trouble I mentioned before, it's moved closer." He shook a thin layer of frost from his hat and set it on the table. Leia brought him a mug of coffee while I asked him to explain. "Word's out in Hullbrook and half the smaller stops in between," he said. "Some are calling you the man who took in an Apache war leader's kin, and not all mean it kindly. There's been talk about riding south to make a point." He looked from me to Isa. "You'd best be ready if they do." Isa's face didn't change much, but she set her sewing aside slowly. "How many?" I asked. Thatcher shrugged. "Could be a few, could be a dozen. Depends on who's had too much whiskey and who's got the time." He stayed long enough to finish his coffee, then headed back out the door, closing behind him with a dull thud. The rest of the afternoon passed in a kind of quiet that wasn't ease. I checked the rifle I kept above the back door and made sure the box of cartridges was where it should be. Leia tightened the leather straps on her satchel and tucked her herb knife inside. Isa busied herself with supper preparations, her hands steady even as her eyes flicked toward the window now and then. By sundown, the sky was the color of cooled iron, the last light fading fast behind the ridge. The street outside lay empty, the snow showing no fresh tracks since Thatcher left. I banked the fire, high-set the lamp low, and checked the locks on both doors. Isa ladled stew into bowls, the steam curling in the warm lamplight. Leia ate quickly, then set about packing a few small jars into her satchel just in case. The first sound came not long after hoofbeats, again slower this time, deliberate. Isa froze with the ladle halfway to the pot. I moved to the front window and peered through the narrow gap in the curtain. 5 riders sat in a loose line at the far end of the street, their shapes dark against the snow. They didn't move closer right away, just sat there, the wind lifting the edges of their coats. When they finally started forward, I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold bit at my face, and the boards creaked under my boots. They stopped a dozen yards short, their leader leaning forward in his saddle. "Evening, Judge," he called, his voice carrying in the still air. "We've been hearing things about who you're keeping company with." I told him it was a courthouse, not a boarding house, and who stayed under its roof was my decision. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "That's one way to see it. Another way is that you're bringing trouble to this town." I kept my voice level. "If you've come to file a charge, do it in daylight and on paper. Otherwise, you can turn around." One of the men shifted in his saddle, but the leader raised a hand to keep him back. "We'll be watching, Judge," he said. "And if something happens that we don't like, we'll be back." With that, they turned their horses and rode off, their shapes swallowed by the dim light at the edge of town. I went back inside, closing the door firmly behind me. Isa was standing near the stove, Leia beside her. "For now," I told them, "they're gone." Isa nodded once, then returned to the pot, her movements measured. Leia unfastened her satchel and set it back on the shelf. The fire popped in the grate, the only sound for a while. That night, I kept my boots near the bed and the rifle propped against the wall. Isa lay beside me, her breathing even, but not deep enough for sleep. Outside, the wind moved in long, low gusts, pressing against the shutters. We didn't speak, but we both knew the quiet wouldn't last. Something had shifted out there, and it was only a matter of time before it reached our door again. By morning, the snow in the street bore only the faint tracks of the 5 riders who had come the night before. The air was still sharp, but sunlight spilled across the rooftops, turning the frost into a thin shimmer. Isa was already at the stove, the smell of cornmeal and coffee filling the room. Leia was sorting herbs by the window, her fingers steady, her eyes watching the street from time to time. Not long after breakfast, Sheriff Ward came up the walk, his coat collar turned high against the cold. He stepped inside without knocking his boots, leaving damp prints on the boards. "They won't be back," he said, his voice low. "I spoke with the ones leading it. Told them if they set foot here again, they'd answer to me." He glanced at Isa and Leia, then added, "Some folks just needed reminding whose law this is." Isa inclined her head slightly, her gaze steady on the sheriff. Leia offered him a mug of coffee, which he took before heading back out. The door shut behind him, and for the first time in days, the room felt lighter. Over the next week, the unease in town began to ease. Neighbors who had kept their distance started stopping by again, some bringing bread, others offering to trade. Isa returned to her, weaving her hands, moving with an ease I hadn't seen since she arrived. Leia started her rounds to nearby farms once more, tending the sick and the frail without hesitation. One evening, Isa and I walked to the edge of town. The sky was painted in bands of rose and gold, the air still enough to hear the slow creak of the sign above the mercantile. She looked out toward the dark line of hills. "This is home now," she said quietly. I nodded, knowing she meant not just the land, but the people and the life we'd made here. In the weeks that followed, the winter deepened, but so did the peace in our days. The trouble that had loomed so close faded into something distant, like a storm that had passed without breaking. We had not only kept the law, but held fast to a measure of dignity no one could take. Out here, justice isn't always decided in a courtroom. Sometimes it's in the quiet choices, standing your ground without drawing your gun, protecting the people under your roof, giving them the right to belong, without condition. And if you've ever known what it is to fight for a place at the table, or to give someone else theirs, you'll understand. That's the kind of story worth telling again. If it's one you'd like to hear more of, I hope you'll share it and keep listening for the next time I sit down to talk.